Hello, it's nice to see you again. In the 51st episode of BoTV, when I introduced CLBC's Community Inclusion Service, I briefly mentioned one of the ways to receive funding, Individualized funding, or IF. At that time, I said that I would take some time later to explain IF in more detail. So today I will introduce IF in a Q&A format to give you a more detailed explanation. The first question is, what is individualized funding? This refers to a type of funding where once funding is approved by CLBC, one of the parents, a guardian, or an organization called a person-centered society enters into an agent agreement with CLBC. They then receive the allocated funding each month, find the necessary programs for their child, hire the required personnel, and report to CLBC every month on how the funds were spent. The second question is, why did this type of funding come about? In the past, there was no IF system, and the only available funding option was to contract with an agency. However, in some families, the CI programs provided by the agency may not be suitable for their child. So, since parents often know their children better, there were ongoing requests that it would be better for them to directly find and support various programs or activities suited to their child. That's why the IF system was created, and it is said to have been introduced in 2010. And the third question is, what are the advantages and disadvantages of the IF system? The advantage, as mentioned above, is of course that parents can support programs or activities that are suitable for their child. However, the downside is that in order to support these activities, the parent who acts as the agent has to find the necessary programs and hire the necessary people, and this is not so easy. And managing how the expenses are spent each month and reporting them online to CLBC can also be a bit cumbersome administratively. For some people, these administrative tasks are not that difficult, but for others, they can be somewhat challenging. So this is a drawback, but for those who still want to do IF but face these difficulties, there is a form of IF called a host agency. In other words, if you want to have a personalized program or activities tailored to your child, the agency can handle those things on your behalf. At first glance, you might wonder what the difference is between this and a CI, where you contract directly with an agency. If a CI contracted with an agency provides personalized support for your child, then there would be no difference. However, if the agency usually has your child participate in a pre-established program rather than offering personalized support, then there is a difference. If an IF is completely parent-directed and a CI contracted with an agency is entirely agency-directed, then a host agency falls somewhere in between. The fourth question is, what is the procedure then? First, you need to get funding approval from CLBC. However, when you apply for funding from CLBC, it's also a good idea to let them know from the start that you prefer the IF model over the agency contract funding model. Then the CLBC facilitator will ask to submit a plan on how you intend to use the IF model. This is referred to as an individual support plan. If the total amount is under $10,000, you don't need to submit this plan. I'll explain this in more detail in a moment. Usually the amount exceeds $10,000 per year, and if it does, you are required to submit this plan. The reason is that with agency contract funding, the agency is already running established programs and is constantly being monitored. But in the case of IF, the agent also needs to be monitored. They need to determine whether the IF funding, when received by the parent or guardian, can actually be used properly, since there is a possibility that the funding could be used for something other than the child. This process is in place to check for such issues in advance. Let me briefly share my own experience here. The year my child turned 19, and since we had created a 10-year plan when my child was in 10th grade, I submitted that plan. Naturally, I believe the CLBC facilitator was able to trust us enough because of that. So there was no major difficulty in receiving the IF funding. So, from episode 33 to episode 41 of BoTV, I uploaded a series of videos about transition planning. If parents follow along with those videos and set up a transition plan for their child before they graduate from high school, then organize and submit the planned outcomes when applying for CI at CLBC, I believe it will be a great help in receiving funding. Now, when you submit this plan, how should you go about it? Usually the areas where you can use IF are career development, life skills, and social skills. So for each of these areas, you should write down which programs or activities you plan to support. And for each item, specify how many hours per week you will spend, how much you will pay per hour, and so on. In this way, you can calculate how much funding you will need per month and submit your plan accordingly. Then, CLBC takes all of that into consideration and enters into a contract with the parents as agents. Usually, when making a contract, if you are already receiving respite, they combine the CI funding and respite together to create the IF funding contract. Now, for the fifth question, people often say that when you receive IF funding, the amount is less than the agency contract funding. How does this work? There are questions like this. Now, this is partly my own guess. IF is usually managed by the parents, while agency funding is managed by the agency. When the parents are in charge, they typically don't receive program costs or admin fees. However, when the agency manages things, there are various program costs involved, and admin fees are also provided. I understand that this is probably the reason for the difference in amounts. So when parents are receiving funding through the IF program and then decide, I should switch to agency funding and move to an agency, from the agency's perspective, they need to cover program costs and admin fees. So after taking those portions, the remaining amount is used to support the child, which means the support time will inevitably decrease. Therefore, if when moving to an agency, CLBC provides additional payments for program costs or admin fees, then the support time allocated to the child would not decrease. However, if those additional funds are not provided to the agency, there could be a situation where the support time is relatively reduced. Ultimately, this all comes down to discussions with CLBC about how much funding will be provided, so it should be decided through consultation with CLBC. The sixth question is, if parents receive this IF amount, where can they use it? Now, CLBC has clearly specified in the agreement where this funding can and cannot be used, and they provide this document to the agent when the contract is signed. The name of this document is Managing the Money Direct Funding Standard Agreement. Since it's quite lengthy, I can't introduce all of it here, but I'll briefly cover the key points. They are as follows. First, there are two categories you can use. One is the most commonly used. Expenses incurred to support the child, meaning the largest portion will likely be the wages paid to the supporter. Additionally, various related costs that arise while providing support are also allowed. And using the funds for administrative management costs, such as obtaining a criminal record book, is also permitted. Now, the other category allows expenses up to $10,000, and this is not only for the child with a disability, but also for the wellness of the parents. So it can typically be used for recreational programs or social or educational programs, and I heard that it can also be used for the parents. Just keep in mind that the amount is limited to $10,000. So it can be used for things like cooking classes, drum classes, swimming classes, life skills, or workshops. Now, as for what is not allowed, you cannot use it to purchase equipment like computers. Also, you cannot use it for family caregivers, meaning parents' gym or art class fees. And it also cannot be used for your child's therapy. This part can be a bit confusing, but in any case, it states that both medical and non-medical therapies are not allowed. Next, costs that individuals are responsible for, such as bus fares or admission fees, are also not permitted. For more detailed information, please search on Google and refer to the document called Managing the Money Direct Funding Standard Guide. Now next, there are many questions about whether to hire support as an employee or as a contractor. This is not something that CLBC can answer. There are CRA guidelines that define whether someone is an employee or a contractor. Simply put, an employee is someone whose work is directed by the employer, while a contractor is someone who takes the lead in their own activities. From the parent's perspective, these criteria can be a bit ambiguous. For example, if you hire a music or art teacher and entrust them with the work, it is highly likely that they are considered a contractor. However, if you hire a music or art teacher and instruct them to teach specific content at a specific place, then they would be considered an employee. So whether someone is classified as an employee or a contractor depends on who has more control or direction over the work. In most cases, we usually just leave things up to the supporters, so they are often considered contractors. However, if you hire someone as an employee, your responsibilities as an employer increase. For example, you would need to register with WorkSafe BC. You also need to provide insurance for the supporter, and when issuing paychecks, you have to calculate and withhold taxes, so you have to take on the typical employer responsibilities that companies or stores usually handle. On the other hand, if you hire them as a contractor, you simply pay the agreed amount, and the supporter takes care of everything else themselves. Now, moving on to the 8th question, how do you handle reporting? In other words, how do you submit reports? There are 2 cases here. One is called simplified, which applies if the IF amount is less than $10,000 per year. The other is called standard, which applies when the IF amount exceeds $10,000 per year. The Haas simplified method is, as the name suggests, very simple. First of all, you don't need to submit a plan, as we mentioned earlier. Also, the bank account doesn't have to be a separate account specifically for your child. However, I do think that opening a separate account for your child isn't a bad idea. Next, you only need to submit an online report once every 6 months, and the reporting format is also very simple. You just need to write down the total amount spent over the 6-month period. Then, there's the IF Direct Funding Standard Agreement, which is the reporting format used when a single series of funding exceeds $10,000. In this case, as mentioned earlier, you also need to submit a plan. A separate bank account for the child is required. Additionally, you must submit a representation agreement stating that you are acting on behalf of the child. And at CLBC, they will assess whether the parent or guardian is fully capable of acting as an agent. And if the annual funding exceeds $25,000, they will also conduct a credit check on the agent. Online reporting is done every month, and you must submit the report within 30 days of the following month. The reporting method is not that difficult. Before you try it, it might seem quite daunting, but once you actually get into it, it's not that hard. It's set up so that you just select from menus, whether it's respite, nor CI, or some other purpose, like a bank charge, for example. You simply choose the appropriate option. All you need to do is enter the date and amount of the expenditure, how much you spent. So once you actually try it, it's really not that difficult. The reporting site is if.communitylivingbc.ca. That's the site you need to access. When you sign the contract there, they will explain this whole process to you, so you don't need to worry too much. For your reference, since CLBC may conduct an audit at any time without notice, please make sure to keep all supporting documents for your expenses, that is, invoices, receipts, and bank statements. Now, this is the 9th and final question. On the CLBC website, it says that IF funding can also be received by a person-centered society, abbreviated as PCS. What exactly is this PCS? Some people ask this question. If you go to the CLBC website, it's explained in detail there. This refers to a small non-profit organization created to support people with disabilities. In other words, while an agent is an individual, a PCS refers to a non-profit organization that is officially registered under the BC Society Act. According to the regulations set by law, it must also have a board of directors. These organizations serve as agents to support people with disabilities. Why do we choose this method? This is done when it is considered more desirable for several people to manage the funding together, rather than leaving it to an individual alone. It can also take into account the period after the parents have passed away, and there is also the possibility that an individual agent may suddenly become unable to fulfill their role due to unforeseen circumstances. In the case of a PCS, however, it is an organization with a board of directors composed of several people. So even if something happens to one member, others can take over the role, and if someone leaves, another person can be appointed to replace them. This is one of its advantages. PCS was previously called a microboard. If you wish to create a PCS or a microboard, there is an organization called Vela Canada. Please contact them to receive assistance. With this, we have concluded the introduction to individualized funding. Next time, we will return with another topic. Thank you for watching until now.